Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Good morning, and welcome everybody. My name is Marjorie Kuhn and I'm a member of AJC's Board of Governors. I am delighted to welcome you to this morning's AJC University session, 3 years after the JCPOA, examining the Iran threat. In 2015, the US, China, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Russia reached an agreement with Iran on the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran deal. Proponents of the Iran deal believe that the economic and diplomatic relief offered by the JCPOA would moderate the aggressive regime in Tehran and temporarily curb, if not halt entirely, its long-held nuclear ambitions. 3 years later, although we now know, thanks to Israeli intelligence, that Iran entered into the deal having lied about its nuclear program's military dimensions, the official assessments are that the regime is adhering to the letter of the JCPOA. But what Iran is decidedly not doing is moderating its behavior. It has put its destabilizing activities in overdrive. Iran continues to fight proxy wars against its adversaries in places like Syria and Yemen, routinely violates the human rights of its own citizens, and while Iranian leaders continue calling for the destruction of the State of Israel, their engineers are advancing a ballistic missile program that could reach not just Israel, but Europe and eventually the United States. During the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign, then-candidate Donald Trump railed against the JCPOA, and last month, President Trump made good on his campaign promise to withdraw the U.S. from the deal over the objections of world leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and British Prime Minister Theresa May, but with the support of Israeli and Gulf Arab states, including the Saudis and the UAE. As other signatories to the JCPOA try to salvage the deal, many in the international community are asking whether more can be done to stop Iran's regional aggression, its state-sponsored terrorism, its ballistic missile program, and its eliminationist rhetoric toward Israel. In essence, where do we go from here? To help us answer these questions, we are joined by 4 expert Iran watchers. Please help me welcome Head of the Arms Control and Regional Security Program at Tel Aviv University's Institute for National Securities, Emily Landau, Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policies Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, Matthew Levitt, and an Iranian-born Israeli Middle East analyst, Meir Javedanfar, and U.S. Ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017, Daniel Shapiro. Here to moderate this session is Yoav Limor, Senior Defense Correspondent at the prominent newspaper Israel Hayom. Yoav, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I can't see everyone, but it will be okay. We have a full house. It's nice.
A couple of people here.
Yeah, everybody woke up this morning. All right, let's hit it. So we will keep some time for questions from the audience. I will ask you just to keep it as short answers as possible because we have quite a few speakers and very little time as always. I would like to begin with asking you, all 4 of you, looking backwards 3 years back, was the agreement, the JCPOA, a good agreement? Emily?
Okay, well, no.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
The JCPOA was never a good agreement. It never fulfilled the goal for which it was originally negotiated, and that was to be comprehensive on Iran. It was supposed to end this issue, this crisis, for good. And what we got in the end is a deal that is a far cry from that. It has major flaws that are dangerous, especially if the international community fell into this kind of slumber. Quoting the IAEA reports that Iran is complying, so everything is fine, the deal is working. Well, the reason Iran was complying is the deal is not bad from Iran's point of view. Iran negotiated, bargained very well with the international community. They got major benefits for minimal concessions. The major problems with the deal, just to go over them very quickly, the biggest problem, of course, is the fact that this deal has an expiration date. It has the sunset provisions that are unconditional. I mean, they're not conditioned on any benchmarks. So we have a state that is a known violator of an international treaty. A new deal is made with this state to restrict its stockpile of fissile material. But then the deal ends without any conditions, without saying Iran needs to prove that it is now a trustworthy actor after decades of violating the NPT in a deceptive and cheating manner. The deal legitimizes Iran's uranium enrichment program, which it never should have done. Remember, sanctions were placed on Iran for years because of its uranium enrichment activities. And at the end of the day, it got a deal that legitimizes its uranium enrichment activities. How in the world could that have happened? Iran is allowed, under the terms of the deal, to work on a full range of advanced centrifuges that will spin many times faster than the ones it had been using. Iran was told that when the deal sunsets, it will be able to have a full and rich nuclear program with all the enrichment capacity that it wants. How is this promised to an NPT violator, and again, without any conditions placed on it? The deal doesn't cover ballistic missiles. This was one of the first concessions that was made to Iran. Ludicrous. Ballistic missiles are one of three essential components of having a working nuclear weapons capability. You need the fissile material, you need to know how to make a warhead, and you need to marry that warhead to missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. So think about it. Iran, under this deal, was able to move forward with critical elements.
Just checking you.
From the Supreme Leader, sorry. The Supreme Leader disagrees.
Iran was able to move forward with critical elements of a nuclear weapons capability, the advanced centrifuges to spin uranium much faster, and of course the delivery mechanism, the ballistic missiles. A final flaw of the deal, and with this I'll end. Inexplicably, the negotiators, the P5+1 negotiators, agreed not to place the file, the annex, the special annex of the IAEA with all of the information, the intelligence information with regard to Iran's military work. There was an annex called the PMD, the possible military dimension. In the context of a negotiation over a final comprehensive deal, it makes no sense that this annex was not cleared up with Iran as part of the negotiation. But we noticed from the start of the negotiation that the P5+1 were fudging on this. They kept saying, no, the PMD file will be relegated to a separate investigation with the IAEA, but it will be parallel to the negotiations. At the end of the day, the IAEA inquiry investigation into the PMD, which is the heart of, should have been the heart of the negotiations with Iran, because that's the violation. That was relegated not only to a parallel process, but one that only began after the JCPOA was presented. So these are the major flaws. It's a dangerously flawed deal.
Yep, and we could have spoken about terrorism and destabilizing the area that we see in Syria and from Yemen, the whole crescent, the whole Shiite crescent. Matthew, to you, how do you see it 3 years after?
It's all good. Look, I wouldn't ask the question the way you asked it, good deal, bad deal. I think it's more complicated than that. The first point to make is there was a better deal to be had. The main problem I had with the way the Obama administration put it, or some people within the Obama administration put it, was that it was this deal or no deal and therefore war. And having worked on this issue in government for a long time, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence at the Treasury when we put together the Iran sanctions packages, the formal and informal sanctions. That seemed to me to be very flawed. And if you go and speak to some of the Europeans who were leading the European negotiation delegations, as I have, and you speak to them, they will tell you, the French in particular, who were the last holdouts, we did not want this deal. There was a better deal to be had, and the US administration pushed us, and we ended up signing onto this deal, but there was a better deal to be had. But what was this deal? I would put it differently in one way than Emily did, which is that this was not meant to be a comprehensive deal. It was a big problem when officials then called it this joint comprehensive deal, but it was never actually intended to be comprehensive. And maybe that's a problem, but what was it intended to do? I think it's important to recognize that when authorities were negotiating this deal, just how close Iran was, how dangerously close Iran was to being able to have a completed nuclear program. Just how much pressure people were under to put a stop to that. That was the primary directive. I have just the same concerns Emily does about the sunset clauses, etc., but that was not the primary concern. If it buys us 15 years, some people felt, 15 years in which to do other things, then okay. That's a flaw in the deal. It is a flaw in the deal, but I think it is important to recognize what people were trying to achieve at the time. The idea of having a deal with Iran was not a bad idea. There was a better deal to be had, however. By the way, now where we are, I've been very clear. I was against the US pulling out of the Iran deal for all of its flaws, because I thought that the main, that we did have now this time to, if we chose to, and the issues we haven't, nobody has, to find other ways to deal with these proliferation nuclear issues we could have, and more to the point, as you suggested just now, all the other things we could have and should have been dealing with throughout this time. That is to say, the JCPOA does nothing, not only on ballistic missiles, but on Iran's sponsorship of terrorism, and on the huge array of activities that it's engaged in around the world and in the region. And so it is not a violation of the JCPOA at all for us to take Iran to task for all those activities. However, this now gets to a second flaw in the deal. And maybe this is a sign that the deal was so brilliantly written from a lawyer's perspective, where each side can read the deal in completely opposing terms. When Iran looked at this deal, Iran said, you, the international community, have now committed to reintegrating us fully into the international financial system and to ending all sanctions. Valiola Saif, the governor of the Central Bank of Iran, came to Washington, D.C. I was there in the room, and he said, the era of sanctions is over. And I and many others said to him, not true. The era of proliferation sanctions might be over. But all the other human rights, ballistic missiles, counterterrorism sanctions remain, and it's up to you to change your behavior, in which case there'll be none of these sanctions, and you can be fully integrated into the international community. But it's not the case that the JCPOA gives you a get-out-of-jail-free card where you can continue to do all of these illicit activities and say, no, you committed to doing no sanctions against us. This was an inherent conflict within the deal. And Europeans and others weren't clear as to where they were on this issue. Because so many people were so committed to making the deal work, at the end of the day, despite pledges from Secretary Kerry, Secretary Lieu, and others that we would hold Iran's feet to the fire on terrorism in particular, that did not happen. And that to me was a huge, huge flaw in the deal. Separate from whether or not the proliferation aspects of what was a proliferation deal were good enough. And everything Emily said there is spot on. The final thing is this, and again, I say this, we all come with our baggage, with our perspectives. I say this as someone who was deeply involved in forming the sanctions regimes that ultimately were what brought Iran to the table. And that is that anybody, I feel very strongly, that anybody who felt that this deal was going to change the nature of the regime, was going to so empower the relative moderates, that would change the regime, so by the end of the terms of the JCPOA, it'd all be good, because it'd be an entirely different type of regime. That was just pie in the sky. There's no evidence, none, to say that this was going to change the nature of the regime. And if that's what we were banking on, that too, to me, was a deeply flawed perspective within which we went into the deal.
Ambassador Shapiro, you were part of the negotiations because at the time you were an American ambassador here, having quite a few arguments with the Israeli ministers, especially with the Israeli Prime Minister. Looking backwards to the way the Obama administration acted, you heard quite a harsh criticism. How do you see it?
First of all, I don't enjoy looking backwards. I like looking forwards. And this deal is over. And we'll get to that in the rest of the discussion. Obviously, I disagree with some of the criticisms that have been outlined about the deal, although not all of them, in the sense that it was not a perfect deal. And I think it was never expected that one could achieve a perfect deal. Indeed, everything that Matt just described and Emily alluded to about the nature of the Iranian regime and its regional activities and its ballistic missiles and its human rights are things I agree with, are things the Obama administration agreed with. When Secretary Pompeo gave his Iran speech a few weeks ago, he listed about 12 demands about Iran's behavior. I can sign up to every one of them because Iran is a regime that is hostile to Israel, that is hostile to our other allies and to our own presence, and seeks regional domination and seeks technologies to enable to do that and sponsors terrorist organizations. We can stipulate to all of that. What this deal did, in its imperfect way, was buy time. But that's not an insignificant thing to do. In a situation in which, as Matt alluded to, Iran sat 2 months, roughly 2 to 3 months at the outside, from the ability to achieve a nuclear weapon. This deal was designed to push them back to at least a year from that capability and to keep them there for at least a decade, probably more like a decade and a half. Now, that's not perfect. And I always understood us as having an obligation to come back and try to extend the timelines, strengthen certain provisions, deal with other Iranian nuclear graves. In fact, when Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama sat down in November of 2015, after the deal was completed and the congressional review was over, they focused a great deal of that discussion on how will we now confront Iran's other destabilizing regional activities, which we now can do without them taking place under the nuclear umbrella that Iran was essentially had with that 2-month breakout period. So that was my understanding of why that deal was worth having, even with its flaws, even with the things it couldn't cover. But the real question, of course, that President Trump faced when he came in was not was it a good deal or a bad deal, but will we be better off without it than with it? And that's a very different decision, a very different question. And as one listened to Israeli security professionals, from the IDF Chief of Staff, General Eisenkot, to very experienced, recently retired officials like Amos Gilad, during the months preceding the President's decision in May, almost to a person, they said, even though we share many of the concerns about the deal, and maybe they say we see short-term benefits but longer-term worries, they preferred to keep the deal because it enabled them to focus in the near term on the most immediate threats, such as Iran's presence in Syria and some of the other terrorist threats without having to immediately worry about Iran once again being on the threshold of a nuclear capability. So there was a very worthwhile effort underway between the United States and the Europeans to try to negotiate strengthening elements to the deal, lengthening the sunsets, improving the inspection protocols to get to the military sites, including sanctions on ballistic missiles. They were proceeding for reasons that are still unclear to me. President Trump set a quite arbitrary deadline of May 12th and seemed completely disengaged actually on what were actually some pretty productive discussions between the professionals, and then he canceled the deal, which I think was always his intention. He wanted to cancel the deal. He promised to. It's an Obama legacy item. He canceled it. Now I think after Meir talks, we'll talk about, well, what's the plan going forward? I don't know what the plan going forward is, and we will lose some of the benefits, but without having put in place the structure that will buy us some of the same advantages that that imperfect deal provided.
Yes, Meir, I want you please to focus on the Iranian side. How do they look at the agreement? Because Ambassador Shapiro spoke of the agreement buying time, whereas I thought it should buy a solution, which is something totally different.
It's, in terms of the Iran, I mean, which Iran are we talking about? Are we talking about the Iranian government, the Iranian regime, or the Iranian people? The deal was supposed to have improved the economic status, the lives of Iranian people. Let's just say within the last 2 years, $59 billion of Iranian funds, money owned by Iranian investors, has been transferred out of Iran. If you want to just put that into perspective, that's almost the equivalent of 83% of Iran's total earnings from oil last year was transferred by Iranians outside of Iran. It was transferred into Georgia. It was transferred into Turkey. As much as the people of Iran supported the deal, and I think they still support it, there's not a lot of trust held in Iran's economy because people see the incredible amount of corruption, the incredible amount of mismanagement in Iran. So, I mean, we talk about cryptocurrency. Last year, $2.5 billion worth of Iranian funds were transferred out of Iran by private Iranian investors through Bitcoin and through other cryptocurrencies that are being introduced. I think the majority of people don't have faith in the regime, but they saw the deal as something to save the livelihood of ordinary Iranians from what looked like the abyss and now what looks like the abyss now. In terms of the Iranian regime saw the deal as something to save its economy, because the economy is very important, but the Iranian regime has great deal of concern about the deal, which is where I respectfully disagree with my colleague here, Emily, who I respect and adore very much. I think it's very easy for us to say in Israel, to sit in this nice air conditioning room and say the equivalent of, yes, I'd like Hamas tomorrow to disarm all of the weapons. Yes, it sounds wonderful. We all want it. Is there anybody here who doesn't want it? No. And I think it's the same to expect the Iranian regime to give up enrichment and to give everything up and stop its nuclear program. It's not going to happen, because as much as it's our right to demand it, as much as it poses a threat to us, there are dynamics within the Iranian regime. You can negotiate with your enemy, but you can't expect him to commit suicide. Nobody comes to a table to negotiate a deal, which is political suicide for the regime. Now, some of us here might say, well, the Iraqis didn't rebuild the nuclear weapon program after it was bombed by Israel. The Syrians didn't do it. The Libyans didn't do it. Yes, correct. But the reason is the Iraqi regime, the Syrian regime, and the Libyan regime did not even talk about their nuclear program. In Iran, it has been, the nuclear program has been wedded so much to the legitimacy of the regime. It has been outed and it has been discussed and it has been tied in so much to the legitimacy of the regime that to give up its complete enrichment would mean suicide. Now, one thing I would like to, as much as this is not a perfect deal, the opponents to be honest and to say that this important fact. Thanks to President Obama's JCPOA, you might hate Obama or you might love him. That's up to you. I'm not an American. But today, because of the JCPOA, Iran is the most inspected country on the face of the planet, which is a member of the NPT. Now, you might expect any inspector to walk into any Iranian military site like you walk into a coffee shop in order to see all your equipment. That's not going to happen. There's a procedure. It takes 24 days for Iran to give access. And of course, it is correct, and I'll be very happy.
They do not comply with it.
Dear friends, I'll be happy to share this on Facebook. I'll put it on my Facebook, and we'll see who is right. You can inspect up to 24 days. It takes up to 24 days for the procedure to get to a site. And of course, Iran could clear up any site of enriched uranium, but it takes 300 million years to clear up any enriched uranium, so the traces are there. Has IAEA tried to get into sites after the nuclear deal and Iran has refused? No. So it's not a perfect deal, but let's mention that it has contributed greatly to the security of the State of Israel. Numerous former heads of the Mossad, who may know a thing or two about Iran and about the nuclear program, have backed the deal. Israel's nuclear energy program has backed the deal, even though, do we have energy in Israel? Not yet. It is not a perfect deal, but it is a deal that it cost the Iranian regime a great deal to get here. It didn't serve what the people of Iran wanted it to serve, but now it's dead, so let's move on.
Two remarks, I take the moderator right, to what was said here. It's true, Meir, that the heads of the Israeli Defense Administration supported the deal, but there is a huge but to that. They wanted a better deal. They were very, very angry with the American administration who didn't push a better deal.
Why did so many people come and disagree with Trump now after he walked out of the deal?
Please let me finish. They were very, very angry with them not pushing, as Emily mentioned, the missile side, the terror side, what we see, the Shiite spread within the Middle East and the Gulf, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Dan is very, very much familiar with that because it was within the negotiations at the time. And I don't know even one intelligence person in Israel or outside Israel who would put his hands and swear that Iran complies with everything that you said. You know with intelligence, you know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. So we should be, the way I see it, a bit shy. We saw the Mossad thing that Netanyahu did a huge thing out of it a few weeks ago. But it is back to 2000. It is back to 2003. It's true. So we don't know forward to that. And I suggest that we remain shy of what we know and what we don't know. But that's the way I see it. Anyway, May 8th, President Trump decides to pull out of the deal. I believe that all four of you, especially the two American gentlemen sitting in the middle, will say that we have to look and see what happens in Singapore tomorrow and then understand what's going to happen in Tehran in the future. But let's try and look, as you like to do, Ambassador Shapiro, forward and not backward, and try to understand what we should look for, because the Europeans are a bit, I don't know. They don't know where to go, what's going to happen, and the Iranians to follow, look around and try to understand what's next in line. How should we look at that?
Well, look, as I said, when the president made the decision to withdraw from the deal, that's as far as he had thought, as far as I can tell. And this is actually consistent with a lot of his decisions, especially those that involve dismantling various Obama-era signature programs, DACA, TPP, healthcare, the Iran deal. There's a decision to end or to cancel, but not a plan to go forward. So I think many, many questions remain about what the strategy is. Secretary Pompeo gave a speech, and he gave a speech in which he outlined some of our goals, and I, as I mentioned, agree with most of those goals. But in terms of what the strategy is to achieve those goals, many, many questions remain unanswered. So, for example, the tool that Secretary Pompeo outlined to try to achieve those goals is maximum sanctions, very tough sanctions. Well, most of those sanctions will not be imposed on Iran. As Matt said, we have many, many sanctions on Iran, and the United States will maintain those, but sanctions on other countries or the companies of other countries if they try to do sanctioned business with Iran. We've already seen some European companies start to pull out of Iran, but as I'm sure Matt could testify better than I do, sanctions enforcement is a full-time job. Even when you have a compliant international community, even when you have consensus, it's a full-time job. And here we clearly don't have consensus, not among our allies, and certainly not among other countries, Russia, China, India, maybe South Korea and Japan, who may be purchasing Iranian oil and be able to do it in ways that evade U.S. sanctions unless the enforcement is very rigorous.
There is a scoop within your saying, because after the last weekend, saying that the Europeans are friends of the Americans is quite a thing.
Yeah, after what we saw in Quebec over the weekend, I think we have to worry, in all seriousness, we have to worry about the stability of the Western alliance and how it will affect our ability to do things like enforce sanctions that do require a certain amount of cooperation. I'll just briefly list a couple of other questions. One is, what happens when the deal collapses formally? The deal actually hasn't collapsed formally. The United States withdrew. Both the Europeans and the Iranians said they're still committed to it. That's not going to last. European companies will pull out. Iran will see that it's not getting the sanctions relief that it anticipated. It will, as it started to announce, it will do slowly walk and then later more quickly walk toward resuming its enrichment. I would predict within about 2 years, Iran will be back to the threshold status it was of about a 2-month breakout. I think those are inexorable pulls. And then the administration will have to make some decisions. Military options, we won't have a lot of other options. U.S. military options, green light an Israeli military option to push Iran further back from that deadline. Many people listened to Secretary Pompeo's speech and said, well, there's no way Iran is going to just throw up its hands and comply with all those many very legitimate demands to change its behavior. That would require regime change. Well, maybe that is the U.S. position. Is it? He didn't say it, but if that's the only way you could achieve all of those objectives, what's the actual strategy to achieve regime change? We know when America tries to impose regime change from outside, it generally goes very poorly. What's our strategy to help empower those Iranians inside who might actually be able to achieve it? And by the way, regime change doesn't always lead to a good outcome, even if you get it. It could lead to chaos. It could lead to uncontrolled nuclear materials. So has anyone thought about those strategies? What about winning hearts and minds? In Iran, the Iranian regime is not popular with many Iranians, and yet they have the hands on the levers of state media and state propaganda, and it will be very easy for them, or they will certainly make a strong attempt, to shift the Iranian people's dissatisfaction that has been directed toward the regime in recent demonstrations and say, no, we are not the cause of your economic hardship. The cause is the Americans who have reimposed sanctions and reneged on a deal they reached. So what's our strategy? It's not going to be one speech by Pompeo to keep Iranians focused on the fact that if they are dissatisfied, their discontent should continue to be aimed toward the regime and not toward us. We've talked about the Iranian regional activities. We all agree how dangerous their arming of terrorist groups and their participation in the Syrian civil war and the Yemen civil war and their shipping of weapons around the region are. Well, we say, Pompeo said we're going to do more. What are we going to do? Are we going to interdict Iranian ships? Are we going to join Israel in strikes on Iranian assets in Syria? Or will we do that against the Houthi in Yemen? These are very serious questions, which, again, I don't know the answers to. I'm not sure I'll oppose the answers once they're forthcoming in the administration. I just don't think they have really been thought through. And the last one is North Korea. How will what's unfolding in these talks in North Korea affect it? On the one hand, I worry, just because I know how Washington works, that it's very hard for any administration to focus on more than one major project at a time, at least in foreign policy terms. This is going to suck up an enormous amount of oxygen. It's not going to be a one-day summit. It's going to be an ongoing negotiation, and this is going to be the primary focus of the administration. Sanctions enforcement and confronting Iran's regional activities will take daily presidential attention. I don't know that he has that ability to have that attention on the two of them. Second, we are going to have a lot of countries who are going to be demanding to sustain, I hope, maximum pressure on North Korea, again, because those negotiations are not going to produce immediate dividends. It's going to take time. Can we get them to maintain maximum pressure both on North Korea and on Iran at the same time? I think we complicate it. Conversely, we may find that the president is prepared to sort of acquiesce to North Korea maintaining a significant nuclear capability. I hope not. He said the goal is comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. And yet, there are also discussions that say maybe we'll have a U.S. embassy in Pyongyang later this year, and maybe we'll have a McDonald's there, and maybe we'll actually allow the Chinese, or not stop pressuring the Chinese on their sanctions, and North Korea will maintain some of those capabilities. And if that happens, you think the Iranians will seek less? Do you think we'll have support from the Europeans to demand less from the Iranians? I think there's going to be a very interesting interplay between those two.
One quick remark, according to Defense Minister's Lieberman last visit in Washington, they were talking with the Americans about a time frame of 18 to 24 months for an Iranian breakthrough. Not 2 months, 18 to 24, that's the last discussion that they had last
goal?
Yeah, if Iran leaves the deal and everything until they, we can disagree on that as well, on everything. I quote them during the last talks that they had. Matthew, how do you see things unfold from now?
So I agree that the president wanted, clearly, because he did, to pull out of the deal, but there's nothing else that has been put in place. There's no clear strategy. Saying that you want to destroy the IRGC and Hezbollah is a wonderful statement that I would wholly endorse, except that you can't do that tomorrow in the real world. And those of us who've been working on these issues for a long time kind of rolled our eyes, like, that's a nice idea, it's a great aspiration, how are you going to do it? And if you look at the how you're going to do it, it comes down to primarily sanctions. I'm a big proponent of sanctions. I've been very involved in sanctions. Let me share a little secret with you. Sanctions is not a strategy. Sanctions are a tactic, they're a tool. And I used to participate in government meetings where people would say, look, we don't have a good idea of what to do about problem X. Surely we got to do something. And they'd turn to me and they'd say, Matt, can't you guys designate something? And I'd say, sure, but why? Tell me what you're trying to achieve. What is the strategy? And I'll get you there. And I won't get you there with sanctions alone. Sanctions, diplomacy, military, you use tools together, it'll get you where you want to go. If you wake up in the morning and your sink is broken and there's water flying everywhere and you call in a plumber and that plumber comes in with one tool, it's going to be a very long, wet day. You come to a problem like Iran with one tool of sanctions, it's not going to go well. So what is the strategy and how are we going to do this? A. B, the idea that we can put together the kind of international, multilateral, and unilateral, formal and informal, all the different types of sanctions, and it was a package of all kinds of different things, that we could put that together again today the way we once did without our international alliances the way they once were, is not possible. Everything is interconnected. If we impose steel tariffs on Europe and think that the Europeans will just go along with us on other things, put that in one corner and be very happy to deal with us in another. I was just in Brussels. I can guarantee you that will not happen. I look at what happened at the GC just now as very, very, what did I say?
G7.
Right. Well, hopefully it'll remain the G7, both in terms of Russia not joining and the U.S. still being a member. As very, very disturbing. I look at, for example, our many different types of relationships with China. And I wonder, let's say China decides that it continues to want to have some Iranian oil. Are we going to act on and impose our secondary sanctions on China at a time when we need China more than anything on North Korea? Everything is interconnected, and right now the administration doesn't seem to really demonstrate an understanding of that. I'll give you another example. In terms of our bilateral negotiations with China, the president appears to have decided that he can strike a deal and remove sanctions, U.S. sanctions against a major Chinese telecommunications company, ZTE, as a deal with China. The problem is that ZTE was sanctioned because it was a major espionage case. The U.S. intelligence community is just really upset that ZTE could be on the table at all. So now you're Iran, or you're North Korea, and what's the lesson you take away from this? Even something that is a massive espionage case that the U.S. intelligence community is all up in arms about, for the president, maybe it's all on the table. So I just can't tell you what exactly comes next, except that sanctions alone won't do it. And the last point I want to make is this, because you'll have a lot of people who will say to you, but look at all these companies that are pulling it out of Iran already. Look at all these banks that are not providing financing already. And the world is interconnected. The French petroleum company Total is a French company, but a huge percentage of its international loans are with American banks, and therefore it's really reliant on American rules in this regard. It's all true. But we cannot achieve what we need to achieve with Iran through US unilateral sanctions alone. The final point is simply this, and I explained this to the Europeans very recently. You like it or not, you Europeans do not have enough strength to maintain this deal. The president has more than enough power with the sanctions he has in his own back pocket to kill this deal. But he does not have enough power to do anything beyond it in sanctions without you, and so I think we're at a little bit of an impasse.
Thanks, Matthew. Meir. Go ahead.
What's the question?
Where are we going from now?
Well, you know, it's always difficult when you talk about a regime that while President Obama made the most important overtures, he wrote more than 3 letters to the Supreme Leader of Iran. While there was a golden opportunity to improve the Iranian economy and to bring Iran out of isolation, he hosted a Holocaust cartoon competition. And not only that, after the Holocaust cartoon competition was held, he congratulated the organizers. This was a major opportunity which was missed by the Iranian regime, and the reality is that because the Iranian regime cannot survive without being anti-American. And this is where President Obama seriously created a challenge for the Iranian regime, because it put its anti-American, it created a huge challenge for the regime's anti-American rhetoric. What about now? Well, there is a sunset clause that is already on Iran, not on the nuclear deal. There's a sunset clause on the integrity of Iran, on the territorial sovereignty of Iran, which nobody talks about. And I think it was built into President Obama's plan. It is called the drought. The drought which Iran is facing could change the demographic map of Iran. The drought which Iran is facing could lead to massive depopulation of major cities, could lead to serious increase in the various sicknesses that people in Iran have, and that sunset clause is already on its way. Within next year, Tehran could have water shortages. Water could be rationed within Iran. If the Iranian regime had an ounce of decency, it would be on its hands and knees right now and getting everybody in the administration of Khamenei. Forget Rouhani. Rouhani doesn't have that much power. It's the office of the Supreme Leader which has the most power. To be looking at every country in the world which has desalination plants. I don't expect them to come to Israel because we know why. But there are other countries as well. But they're not doing this. And this is the most important issue. This is the most important issue facing the people of Iran. There could be, my father's from the city of Isfahan. He nearly drowned in Zayan Derud when he was a child. Today you can go horse riding where there was a river. It's completely flat, dry.
Yep.
And this is the issue that Iran is facing. Will this affect how it behaves in its nuclear strategy? I think President Trump, and this is why I agreed with the nuclear deal provided a strategy which gave Iran a face-saving and gave America important tools to keep an eye on Iran's nuclear program. Right now, as terrible as this regime is, and as much as I hope it disappears from the face of the earth tomorrow, this regime has been left with no other option that soon it will go back to enrichment to 20%, and that's why I disagree respectfully with Defense Minister Lieberman, because once the Iranian regime goes back to 20% enrichment, we'll be back again to 2 or 3 months breakout.
Thank you. Emily, last...
But you're going to give me equal time, right?
Oh, don't start. You spoke longer at the beginning. I have to leave time for questions, so do it very quick.
I'll be very telegraphic, but there's a lot to say. First of all, on inspections, I need to clarify the situation, because this is said all the time, that this deal gave the most transparency into Iran's nuclear program. Where the inspections were increased was at the declared nuclear facilities. We did not need more inspections at the declared nuclear facilities. What we had with the NPT was enough. Where we needed inspections was at military facilities. where Iran was hiding their military nuclear program. We did not get this with the deal. I could go into the provisions. We don't have time for it. Believe me, the provisions are convoluted, they're ambiguous, and they give Iran a lot of room, wiggle room, to play for time. Since the deal was implemented, I can't tell you as an independent analyst that follows this so closely whether there have been inspections at any military facilities. I think at Parchin, no. Even though in September 2015, there was one inspection in Parchin, a military facility where Iran had been doing military work, and they found suspicious particles. But they have never come back to Parchin. We don't know if IAEA Director General hasn't asked for an inspection because he's afraid the Iranians will say no. This has been reported even in Haaretz. Or whether he just didn't ask for an inspection. But the sense is that we have not had inspections at military facilities. As far as Israel's support for the deal, I just want to say, and again, I don't have, unfortunately, time to go into it, but the Israeli debate has been misconstrued and brought into the American debate from the negotiations over this deal in a very bad way. It has been used politically by the Obama administration in order to give the sense that Prime Minister Netanyahu is isolated in his position and everyone else in the security establishment thinks differently. That is simply not the case. Sometimes things were taken out of context. Sometimes people forgot that Israelis were talking to Israeli audiences, and the messages were therefore a little bit different. But there are important Israelis, Moshe Ya'alon, Amidro, people that are very negative on this deal, so that whole construction is a little bit problematic. As far as what's happened since the beginning of this year and where we're going, I just need to be very short, but I can say that the negotiations between the Americans and the Europeans from February to April, where they were supposedly talking about strengthening the deal so that Trump wouldn't leave the deal, we have no account in the public domain about what exactly happened in those negotiations. The Europeans claim they did everything possible to answer Trump's concerns. Trump administration says something else, but we have no public record. And that's very problematic because going forward, we need to know where were the points of agreement between the Europeans and the Americans. Where were they disagreeing? What were the sticking points? Macron, when he came to Congress, to America, when he came to America in late April to convince President Trump not to leave the deal, he made a proposal in Congress. He had a 4-point proposal. And he took into account that Trump might leave the deal with that proposal. What happened to that proposal? Is Macron still committed to it? We don't know. These are important questions for going forward. What it seems that the Trump administration is interested in doing right now is to use the pressure of sanctions to renegotiate the deal. This raises a lot of questions, again, that need to be answered. But first, we need to know a little bit about the history of the negotiations between the Americans and the Europeans.
All right, so now to your questions. I'm going to try, and now I'll be a tough policeman. Short questions, short answers. There is a nice story I heard about a decade ago in America about a young lecturer entering his lecture, starting by apologizing for having an ugly cut on his face, saying to the crowd, "This morning while I was shaving, I was thinking of my speech, so I cut my face." An elder gentleman stands up from the crowd and says to him, "Young gentleman, instead of thinking of your speech and cutting your face, you should have thought of instead of thinking of your speech and cutting your face, you should have thought of your face and cut your speech." So please cut your speeches so we will be able to keep it to as many questions as possible. Please, there are microphones around the room. Feel free, there is a question here. The gentleman with the red, if I still see at the age of 50, yeah, I do.
At the age, it's the glare.
It's both. Go ahead.
Hello, my name's Adam. I'm a student at the University of British Columbia. We are here at the AJC to discuss Israel. And from an Israeli advocacy advocacy perspective, a lot of the conversation about the Iranian nuclear threat is often used by those who seek to delegitimize the state of Israel by pointing out that Israel is not a member of the NPT and that Israel allegedly possesses nuclear weapons. And as an advocate for Israel, I've had a lot of trouble personally dissecting and deconstructing this line of argumentation. So I would appreciate your expertise in attempting to address this question. Thank you.
Emily, take that. I think it suits you most. No, one-on-one. Let's do it fast. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to do it fast, although it's hard to give the quick answer on this.
Quote Shimon Peres. It works. Usually it works.
Israel and Iran could not be more different in almost every respect, and with regard to the nuclear issue as well. When we deal with nuclear issues, we can't take the nuclear out of the context. It's nuclear in context. So we can start with the most clear difference between Iran and Israel, and that is that Iran joined the NPT, made a commitment not to work on a military nuclear program, and then proceeded to work on a military nuclear program for decades, hiding it, deceiving the international community, cheating, and that's Iran's history. Until today, Iran says we never did anything wrong, even though we now have the revelations from inside Iran. Israel made a decision back in the late 1960s not to join the NPT, even though it paid a price for not joining the NPT. And the reason is probably Israel was on the verge of becoming a nuclear state. It is an assumed nuclear state, and that happened probably somewhere around 1968-69, just as the NPT was being negotiated. There was a debate in Israel, and the final decision was taken that Israel could not afford to join the NPT because the conditions of the NPT are such that Israel could only join as a non-nuclear weapon state. It would have had to disarm itself of its nascent, assumed nuclear capability. But it paid a price because the NPT gives states benefits as far as civilian nuclear programs. Israel's history and record is of restraint and responsibility in the nuclear realm. The Arab states knew throughout the years that there was only one scenario in which they had to worry about Israel's assumed nuclear capability, and that was if they sought to pose an existential threat on Israel. Short of that, you have seen all the conventional wars that Israel has been involved in, and never did the nuclear issue come onto the agenda, including the Yom Kippur War. That is now a proven fact, and that is a very solid record of restraint and responsibility. So these two states have totally different records in the nuclear realm. Do not take the nuclear out of context.
There is a question in the back.
Coming from Hungary, as a son of Holocaust survivors, I was totally shocked that Germany didn't support Israel's point during the Iran negotiations. Can you explain what is the reason of the terrible behavior of Germany?
I'll be very quick on answering you. Germany was the biggest supporter of Israel, much bigger than the US during the years prior to the agreement of 2015. Germany was the closest one. That's why Germany was the +1. It was P5 +1. Germany was the +1 added then, and there were very close ties between Israel and Germany at the time. Anyone want to elaborate on that?
Can I just add? So
Go ahead.
the JCPOA is there to make sure that Iran does not become a nuclear state. That's the whole reason, because nobody wants this regime, which is a terrible regime, to have nuclear weapons. And that's why I think our friends in Germany and the rest of Europe supported us, because they saw this as a strategy to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear state. President Trump, now we're going to find out, can he stop it? Then we wish him all the best of luck. But if he fails, then we are all going to share the burden.
But the question was on Germany, and I think Germany, especially under Chancellor Merkel, but quite a few years backwards, since the beginning of the 90s, is very close to Israel and very supportive of Israel. We see the submarine thing. We saw the Iranian deal. I don't think Israel can be worried of what's coming from Berlin. There are bigger worries in Europe for Israel than Germany. Please.
Hi, I'm Serena. I'm a media analyst in Berlin. And my question is, it has been mentioned before in the panel.
They can't hear you.
Okay, is it better? Can you hear me?
Now.
Okay, I'm Serena. I'm a media analyst in Berlin. And as you have been mentioned before on the panel is, my question is the following. What are reasons for the European Union to not be able to retain the nuclear deal?
Go ahead, Matthew.
What are the reasons for them to be able or not?
Not to be able.
Why won't it?
Right. So the international financial system is interconnected. And if you want to do business other than a mom and pop shop, you want to do business in the United States. Unfortunately, the way Americans work is we buy a lot. And we run out of money, we borrow so we can buy some more. And we worry about
it sounds like my wife.
Time. Yeah. You're a brave man when she's right not next to you, okay? If my wife was watching, you're the best. So the point is, you want to do business in the United States because the United States purchasing power. Because of the way U.S. sanctions are structured and secondary sanctions, if you want to do business in the United States, you're not going to be able to do that kind of business with Iran. So the Europeans are going to try and put things in place to try and make it easier for European companies and more importantly for European financial institutions to continue doing business with Iran, and they are already failing. Businesses and banks are all pulling out because they are prioritizing their business with the United States. The EU is talking about putting in place blocking legislation, which worked once upon a time when US had sanctions on Cuba, but since then the international financial system has completely changed. Those blocking authorities are useless, absolutely useless. The EU even came out recently with a statement saying that it was calling on the European Investment Bank to make it easier for European institutions to do business with Iran, but we're not telling the EIB what to do. They have to make their own decisions, and the EIB came out right away and said, yeah, that's not happening. So Europe does not have the capability to maintain the deal as it is. The financial relief that Iran wants can't happen. By the way, I would argue is always problematic even if you supported the deal wholeheartedly, simply because of things like Iranian corruption. Iran wasn't going to get the kind of relief it wanted anyway because of corruption and because other sanctions, counterterrorism, human rights, ballistic missiles were still on the table. But now Europe does not have the capability. On the flip side, the United States, without its allies, is not going to be able to put together the kind of sanctions regimes in the plural that made life so impossible for the regime that they saw the nuclear program, which Meir is right, they see as critical to maintaining the regime. The kind of sanctions we put in place were so horrible for them that was even more threatening to the regime. I don't think we're going to be able to do that again without our allies.
We have a question here at the back. There is a gentleman. Please.
Hello, my name is Alexander. I'm with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Israel. My question goes to Emily. Most of the people I've heard who disagreed with the deal in the first place still said, now that it was on the table or it was working, you should keep it there. So would you share this opinion, or would you say that there's really a chance to get a better deal?
Okay. I have a problem with the statement that the deal is working when you base that just on IAEA reports saying that Iran is complying with the minimal concessions that it made. As I said in my opening remarks, Iran is more or less complying because the deal is not a bad deal from Iran's point of view. So if there's evidence that it's complying, and by the way, it's not complying with everything, again, we don't have time to go into everything, that doesn't make it a good deal. Having said that, I certainly was not advocating to leave the deal. We were working at INSS and in a lot of my own writing, I had been talking from the beginning of the Trump administration, even before I knew who was going to be elected, saying that the way forward is to strengthen the deal. And there's a lot to do that could have been done to strengthen the deal without even renegotiating it. So that's what I thought was the way forward. The other thing, however, that I thought certainly needed to be done was to change the U.S. approach to Iran to restore U.S. deterrence vis-a-vis Iran, to understand that Iran's threats to leave the deal, if the U.S. pushed back on everything, were empty threats, because Iran wants the deal, because the deal is not bad for Iran. And that's certainly one thing that President Trump did achieve. After the deal, everyone was put into a deep slumber. Okay, we put the check in the box, we've dealt with Iran, everything's fine. President Trump woke everyone up. And it was President Macron of France who was the first in August 2017. He was the first one to suddenly say, you know what? Yes, you're right. Not everything is good with this deal. Sunset provisions, they're a problem. Ballistic missiles not covered by the deal, that's a problem. Iran's destabilizing activities in the Middle East, oops, a problem. None of that would have happened if the U.S. president hadn't changed course in terms of his overall approach to Iran and exposed all of the bad behavior.
We have a question there at the back.
Hi, my name is Idan Zabihi. I'm a student at Indiana University, Kelley Business School, and I'm a student at Indiana University, Kelley Business School, and I had the opportunity to study the Iran deal in some research papers in the past couple of years. And while the United States benefits and perspective of the deal seems, in my opinion, to not have changed too much, Israel seems to have, it has seemed to benefit differently in 2015 than it does in 2018, in the sense that in 2015 it seemed that it was definitely against the deal, and while it still seems, the Netanyahu administration seems to definitely still be against the deal, they seem to have gained massively from it in relations with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And while they can still publicly be against the deal, do you think that they may have benefited greatly from it, even though they won't necessarily admit it?
Dan, you want to take it?
Yeah, look, there's undoubtedly an alignment of interests between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. They see Iran as a common threat. They see some other common threats, the Sunni radicals in the region as well. I don't know, sometimes people would say, kind of half jokingly, that maybe this was one of the benefits that Obama provided to Israel, is that he pushed the Arab states, the Sunni Arab states and Israel closer together in opposition to what Obama was trying to do. Certainly that's not how it was conceived, but you can imagine there's some benefits from that. I guess I'd be cautious about exaggerating what can be achieved in that. In those channels. The security and intelligence sharing is significant. The alignment is the same, but none of those countries have all that much to bring to the table in terms of either economic pressure or military threats against Iran. Israel and the United States are the main relevant actors on any kind of military deterrence, and the United States and others in the international community much more so on the economic side. And whether this will produce a broader opening and normalization and open exchanges of cultural and economic and diplomatic channels between Israel and the Sunni Arab states, I'm quite doubtful until there's some kind of significant progress that one can point to on the Palestinian issue. I don't think that issue has gone away, and those Arab states are getting most of what they want anyway from Israel. You'll see little gestures of overflight of an Indian airline, a friendly interview by Mohammed bin Salman, but we're not going to see embassies of Sunni Arab states opening here just because they agree with Israel and Iran, unless we're somewhere on the road to a resolution of the Palestinian issue.
Okay.
If I could just add 2 quick points.
Quickly, because we have to sum
what
up,
is
and
also
I want to ask
what is
last
a
question.
strategic asset to Israel is also the idiotic policies of the Iranian regime, such as setting fire to the Saudi embassy in Tehran as soon as the deal was approved, and also the attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador, which was discovered in 2011. these things brought Israel together, and we really have to Ayatollah Khamenei to thank for those as well.
Okay, I want to ask you last question from the Israeli side, Ambassador Shapiro. We discussed lately, publicly, the Israeli attack on the Syrian reactor in 2007. One thing that was on the table was that Israel came to the US administration, to President Bush. It wasn't even Obama that Israelis like to hate so much. It was President Bush who attacked in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And Israel said to him, there was no argument on the intelligence. There was a nuclear reactor that was aimed to make a bomb, which Israel is the target at the end of the day. Jerusalem and Washington were not in dispute on that. Israel came to the US and said, attack it, you, the Americans. A, because then there will not be a war between Syria and Israel, because they won't attack you, the Americans. And B, because it will deter everyone, especially the Iranians. The US in Washington, you dealt with it, and you decided, not you personally, the Americans decided not to do it. And the feeling in Israel at the time and currently was that we were left home alone. Was it a fair thought? And what does it say about the future? Is Israel alone? Look, despite what Trump did this month, is Israel alone?
Fortunately, Israel has tremendous capabilities, as it has demonstrated in that attack, and it has demonstrated more recently in its ability to confront and degrade Iranian attempts to entrench itself militarily in Syria. I say that fortunately because Israelis want to fight their own battles. They generally do not seek the United States to do that, and Israel's ethos of self-reliance is critical to its own national self-identity and its ability to deter its enemies. But I do think the question you posed, Yoav, is absolutely going to become current in the scenario we're headed down. In the scenario we're headed down, where European companies stop doing business with Iran, where Iran feels justified that it can now be released from its obligations under the JCPOA and begin resuming enrichment, and comes back to the threshold status, 2-month breakout, many tons of enriched uranium sufficient to create multiple nuclear weapons, and that could be within 2 years. Then we will be faced with a question. What if the sanctions have not deterred them, and I think it's very difficult for the reasons Matt stated to expect that to happen at least that quickly, what options are left? At that point, you don't have that many more options other than military ones to regain the time that the JCPOA had gained. And I don't see in President Trump any greater desire than I saw under President Obama, and at least in the case you cite, President Bush, for further Middle East military engagements. Now, of course, President Bush had his in Iraq. That's a big reason why. Because we ended up getting pulled into a long and very bloody and very costly military engagement in Iraq, a separate one in Afghanistan that's not even over. The American people, and I think this has also been demonstrated through numerous chapters of these debates, are also not looking for these major military U.S. contributions in the Middle East. You could say, well, these are surgical strikes, we can do it in one night. I think anybody who believes that the United States simply going in on one night and taking out Iranian nuclear facilities and this is going to be a clean operation is completely off base, and that's certainly the view of the U.S. military. And so therefore, Prime Minister Netanyahu may find himself at the point of a decision much sooner than he ever would have been had the JCPOA stayed in place. Will Israel take that strike? And he may be in that position with an American administration giving him a complete green light. A complete green light. The Obama administration...
Which might be harder than a red light.
The Obama administration, I think it's fair to say, didn't give a complete green light. I'm not sure it was a hard red light either, but it certainly wasn't a green light. If the Trump administration says, Mr. Prime Minister,
feel free,
have at it, then Israel has some very significant decisions to make. I think they have significant capabilities, but again, those are not cost-free decisions.
Matt, 60 seconds, because we have to switch rooms. What do you think of that? Is Israel left alone?
I don't think Israel's left alone. I think the U.S.-Israel relationship is still very, very strong, and it goes beyond individual personalities of presidents or prime ministers. But I think it's incredibly important to stress every single U.S. military and intelligence official I've ever spoken to stresses, and Israeli too for that matter, that a military strike on Iran is exceptionally difficult. It is nothing like Syria. There's no one night or 2 nights or 1 week probably. It's exceptionally difficult. And so it's not so simple as, well, if it doesn't work out, we can use a military strike, separate from what the other ramifications might be from going that route. So I don't think anybody wants to go that route, and I think Iran understands that, which is part of the reason why they are so, though it's also just in their DNA, so aggressive, and all the other things they're willing to do.
And they are the best dealers and merchants in the area at the end of the day. Guys, I want to thank Meir, Dan, Matt, and Emily. Thank you very much. Emily,